and thank you very much for joining us here on this very special conversation here on CNBC-TV18, where we are going to be discussing what I believe to be a very, very important issue, and that is the issue around food security and nutrition security. We were joking just before we got up on stage that if this was a seminar on cyber security, we would have probably had people breaking down the door trying to get in, but because this is something around food and nutrition, it very often doesn't get the kind of response, the kind of urgency and the kind of attention that this issue truly deserves. And perhaps that is one of the things that one could count as a silver lining of the COVID-19 pandemic, because what we saw on account of the disruption, what we saw on account of food price inflation, that forced governments, policymakers, and the average citizen to look at food differently, to focus on food with much more urgency. But what is the road ahead as far as transforming food systems is concerned? Well, I have with me two very, very esteemed panelists who are going to be addressing this very issue. Dr. Lawrence Haddad, for people in the food and nutrition space, the man needs no introduction, but let me, for a wider audience, tell you a little bit about him. He is, of course, the recipient of the 2018 World Food Prize Award. He has worked on several committees. He's chaired the Action Track 1 2021 for the UN Food System Summit. He's been the co-convener of Standing Together for Nutrition, which was in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And today he is, of course, the executive director of GAIN, an organization that's working on the frontiers of transforming food systems. Vinita Bali needs no introduction to a CNBC-TV18 audience, the former chief of Britannia. Vinita has, of course, spent a lot of her time working on the issue of nutrition and, more importantly, on fortification of foods, which is something that she spearheaded at Britannia. Dr. Haddad and Vinita, many, many thanks for joining us here on this conversation. Let me get started with you. Dr. Haddad, you said that, what happened through the course of the pandemic was a wake-up call. But do you believe that we have woken up to the reality of how dire things really are when we talk about food security and nutrition security in specific?
Thank you, Shireen. I don't think any country has woken up to the gravity of the situation even before the crises. We talk a lot about statistics at GAIN, but it's really about the human impact. Malnutrition really wrecks kids' bodies. I mean, I can't think of another condition that literally physically shapes a human's body, shapes their brains. We talk about grey matter infrastructure. Malnutrition wrecks kids' brains. If you do an MRI of a kid's brain that's malnourished, you'll see literally holes in the brain. This means they learn less in school. If they're lucky enough to survive the first 3 years of life, they earn less in the labor force, more likely to live in poverty. It's not consistent with a community and an economy that sees itself at the forefront of economic development. Now, every country, my own included, I grew up in the UK, every country has its health system is essentially supporting and fixing the mistakes in the food system. Every country, its global burden of disease, its premature mortality and its morbidity is driven. The top 10 risk factors in every country, 6 of them will be diet-related. It's the same in India, it's the same in the UK. So I don't think any government, any set of businesses, any set of civil society organizations has really grasped the gravity. And more importantly, they haven't grasped that they actually have an incredible ability to do something about this.
Vinita Bali, and that gives me the perfect segue to address the issue of what we are here to discuss, which is what do we do? And I think the response so far has been governments doing their own thing. Within governments, various bodies and agencies doing their own thing. There is, of course, action at the federal level. There's action at the state level. The private sector is trying to do its own bit. What we do need is a comprehensive, holistic roadmap for how we need to address these challenges, and these are universal challenges. But let's address it and speak about it in the context of what's happening here in India. What do you believe we need to prioritize today?
Obviously we need to do everything we possibly can to ensure that people get not just food, but nutritious food, because that's what Lawrence alluded to as well. I think the issue, Shireen, really is that this is a fairly complex problem to deal with. It has a supply side, which is what is being produced, what is being marketed, where and how it is being sold, at what prices, and then it's got the demand side issue. In India, I believe we've got very good programs structurally. If I think about the ICDS, if I think about the midday meal scheme, if I think about the fact that the PDF system is reaching 800 million people with basic cereal, I think we've really got the infrastructure that, if executed better than we have, if executed with energy, if executed with relevance to where we are today, can for a large part change what we are impacting. I think there's another big thing to do with regulation. What gets sold, where the FSSAI and CII, for example, together with other bodies, have been working very closely to set new standards, whether it is for fortification or high sodium, high fat, high sugar. So there is action that is required on many fronts, and that action is required simultaneously. Earlier we used to talk about nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive interventions. Today we are talking about looking at the entire food system. What we grow, where we grow it, where is it marketed, how is it distributed, the affordability, accessibility, availability. And I actually believe that if there is one holistic structure that is looking at everything, everything has to be executed decentrally. But I think the bigger vision, the bigger purpose of what we want to do has to be orchestrated, if you like, from a holistic perspective.
Speaking of a holistic perspective, and Dr. Haddad, let me get you to respond to that, and it ties in with what you mentioned at the start, that there still isn't an appreciation and acknowledgement of how difficult and complex this problem is and how urgently it needs to be addressed. I remember you wrote through the course of the pandemic that the food system today is actually more dependable or more interconnected and hence less resilient today. And your message to the world was diversity, 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 diversify, diversify, diversify. In the context of that, since you talk about making game-changing changes, what would you say are the 2 or 3 things that governments have the power to control at this point in time?
So let me start to answer your question by saying, think of a barrel, right? A barrel that contains, I don't know, whatever you want it to contain. But barrels have vertical planks. Think of a wooden barrel. They have vertical planks, right? They don't have horizontal planks. And fixing nutrition is about making sure that every plank is the right height. Think of a barrel. If it's got 10 planks around it and one plank is short, all the water is going to run out. It's not good enough to have 9 strong planks. You have to have 10 strong planks. And I think the missing ingredient in the Indian situation right now is everything between the farm and the market. So I think that's where the diversification has to happen. Now, why do I say that? When I look at the ag performance of Indian agriculture, it's pretty good. Most of the increases in outputs of food are generated not by using more land, not by using more fertilizer, it's through innovation, technology, and that's fantastic. When I look at the nutrition programs that are being run through the health systems, the difference between NFHS 4 and 5, the 2 recent surveys, really quite profound. I haven't seen increases in coverage rates like that for a very long time. I don't know how good the quality of it is, but the actual kids who need it are getting it. And yet, as Vinita well knows, malnutrition rates are stubbornly high. Yeah. So what's going on? I think it's that missing middle between the farm gate and the consumer. Why do I say that? Look at food loss is very high in India. A lot of perishable foods are getting lost between the farm gate and the market. Look at what happened in COVID, where food systems ground to a halt. Why did they grind to a halt? A big part of it was that people working in the food systems got sick. If people working in food systems are not well nourished themselves, the whole food system collapses. Third thing, small and medium enterprises. We talk a lot about big business, but actually most people who are on low incomes and are malnourished get their food in markets that are serviced by small and medium enterprises. They have no ability to weather the kinds of storm that we saw. So we need to diversify what we grow, where we grow it, who produces it, how it's produced, and most importantly, diversified diets of women and very young kids.
I'll come to the diversification of diets in a second, but I want to address the missing middle that you spoke of. And Vinita, I want you to comment on that. What is the role that you believe the private sector can play in being able to address this deficit specifically that was spoken of? And even on the issue of SMEs, and Dr. Haddad is absolutely right, even in the Indian context, that's very, very relevant because they are more vulnerable to macroeconomic shocks. And we've seen that play itself out through the course of the pandemic as well. So the role that the private sector can play in both these deficits.
There are at least three big roles that come to my mind, Shirin. One, of course, is taking the whole issue of post-harvest loss. The estimate in India is about 30 to 35%. That is an area where, whether it is investments in cold chain, investment in facilities closer to where harvesting happens, processing closer to where harvesting happens. That's all a question of identifying the opportunity, making the investment, and seeing it work. You cannot possibly go wrong because there's a huge opportunity there. The second thing is, food companies. I think there is a lot that food companies themselves can do to look at the products they sell and ask themselves a question, which is, can I make it more nutritious than it is? It could be micronutrient fortification, it could be changing in the formulation itself, and so on. I think the third big area, Shirin, in India is a big opportunity which comes from the CSR funds. And, from the CSR funds, I don't have to be a food company to contribute to, the preservation of food. I think a lot of CSR money, whether it is in public-private partnerships, can be utilized to actually talk about better farming practices at a very individualistic level, but more importantly, to ensure that wherever capital is required to prop up the industry, it is. Lastly, coming to MSMEs, we know MSMEs in India, there are 640 million MSMEs, and they contribute almost 50% to manufacturing. Now, if that was a sector where we said there is something called nutrition in the workplace, it's a captive audience, there are people who are there, what is it that the private sector can do to up the quotient of nutritious food in the workplace itself?
Pull up the flicks and I take it on beer. Pull up the hands and I feel it more beer. I dig it on. I sick a don. Take it on the roll and the show and the pull up the flicks and I pull up.
Hello, Goosebumps, the new Volkswagen Virtus.
कल आज और कल में देश के हर पल में कल आज और कल में देश के हर पल में कभी परछाई बनके कभी विश्वास बनके दिल में साहस का एहसास बनके उम्मीदों को सच्चाई के रंग से सजाते हैं मुश्किलें कोई हरदम साथ निभाते हैं कल आज और कल में रहते हैं देश के हर पल में रहते हैं कल आज और कल में रहते हैं
1956 से आज तक LIC हर पल आपके साथ।
Play it your way. Play it your way, your way.
I like it.
Play it your way. Play
Sarah, this is your space.
Play it your way.
नमस्कार जी, मैं भगवंत मान। 16 मार्च 2022 को शहीद आजम भगत सिंह के पैतृक गांव खटकड़ कला में हमने पंजाब को रंगला पंजाब बनाने की कसम खाई थी। उसके तहत हम दिन रात काम कर रहे हैं। मुझे बताते हुए बड़ी खुशी हो रही है कि हमारे यत्नों सदका अभी तक 10 महीने में लगभग 40,000 करोड़ का निवेश हो चुका है, जिसके तहत लगभग 2.5 लाख नौजवान बेटे बेटियां पंजाब के उनको रोजगार प्राप्त होगा। हमारा 23-24 फरवरी को मोहाली में इन्वेस्टमेंट समिट हो रहा है, जिसमें जितना निवेश हो चुका है उससे कई गुना और निवेश आने की उम्मीद है। आइए आप भी इस समिट का हिस्सा बनिए और पंजाब को दोबारा रंगला पंजाब बनाने में हमारा सहयोग करें। नमस्कार।
MCX Zinc Mini Futures Contract 1 metric ton, available for trading from Friday, February 17th. Refer to circular on mcxindia.com.
Address this issue of food companies doing what you believe is the right thing, which is to put more nutritious food on the table. Now, you know, one would hope that it is enlightened self-interest that will get food companies to do the right thing. But that's not necessarily been the experience, and that's not necessarily been the case. You have needed regulation to change behavior, to change what companies are putting out in the market. Even currently in India, we've got, as far as labeling norms are concerned, etc., you know, a lot of back and forth between the FSSAI as well as industry. How much has changed from a private sector perspective on this issue, and what more do you believe needs to be done to really forge a greater alignment between industry as well as the changes that we need for the benefit of the consumer?
Shirin, not enough has changed, but a lot has changed. A lot more needs to be done. So, for example, I think in 2007 or 2008, we didn't even have standards for fortification of proprietary foods. Now, there's a lot of work that FSSAI has done to lay down those standards, etc. So there is regulation, but I think you talked about enlightened self-interest. It is important, you know, to put the pressure on companies to, A, look at better formulations, more nutritious formulations. Secondly, to make it harder to sell food which is not nutritious. I also want to be very clear, we're not just talking about everybody eating fruits and vegetables all day long. Of course it is important to, you know, processed food always tastes good. So I think it is, what are the limitations of that? What are the ground rules? What is the framework within which that consumption is going to happen? And more importantly, how do we educate consumers to look for better choices? I think the whole area of nutrition is also in some ways pulled back because nutrition is complex to understand. We need to simplify it and tell people that, you know, this is better than that.
Except that it keeps changing every 24 hours, right? Yes, Dr. Haddad.
So that's so true.
Blame the nutritionists.
I blame the media. No,
as always, we get the rap.
Just to come back to your question, I think businesses, there are sort of 4 pressure points on businesses, and government is clearly one of them. But it must be sticks and carrots, right? So you can't just talk about regulation that's going to punish the ones who are doing bad things. We need to support the ones who are doing good things with tax breaks and utility breaks. If they're producing nutritious food for domestic consumption, let's reward them. Second group is investors. More and more investors are looking for companies that take ESG standards seriously, environmental, social, and governance standards seriously. The problem with ESG standards is there's nothing about nutrition in them whatsoever. The only thing that's in there about health is whether this product's going to blow up or kill you. It's not about whether it's healthy or promotes nutrition. I think the third group is actually the employees. Employees they're kind of driving their companies. They want to work for companies that have a social impact and a social mission. And I think the fourth group that's very important is actually the research community. And the research community is very fixated on what's driving malnutrition, but not enough on what the consequences of malnutrition are and what some of the solutions are. And the evidence is becoming clearer and clearer when it comes to enlightened self-interest. The evidence is clear on CSR. Companies that invest in CSR seriously, eventually, after 3 years, have a higher rate of return on assets than companies that don't. Workforce nutrition. Companies that invest in worker nutrition, every rupee they spend, they get 6 back in terms of improved productivity, lower absenteeism, lower turnover rates. So the evidence is there. We just have to get it into the hands of the managing directors who will see, goodness, if I do this, I'll actually be, even if I don't care about nutrition, my bottom line will be improved.
And yes, at the end of the day, you know, as far as CEOs are concerned, that is the trap that they're also sort of, and you know that, Vinita, you know that that is the balancing act that you have to deliver on quarter after quarter, both as far as the bottom line is concerned, but also wanting to do good as far as the consumer goes.
You know, and I think there are models that are emerging which says you give consumers don't know what they don't know. And therefore, if I go to the consumer with a proposition which is good for the consumer and of course tastes good, it is a winning proposition. I think we have to get away from a little bit of what I call lazy marketing. You know, we have to be more innovative in terms of, you know, what is being done, with an eye to saying that it is about, you know, adding rather than subtracting.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Haddad.
Just on lazy marketing, I couldn't agree more. I think some of the public, and I'm talking now about the public sector, some of the public sector messaging I see in countries all over the world, including the one I live in, the messaging about healthy food is very boring. It's very, you know, left brain. It's logical, it's scientific. You should eat more of these because it's good for you. Any of you have kids, you know that message is not going to work. They'll just roll their eyes at you. You have to appeal to the right side of the brain. Emotion, aspiration, colors. I mean, that's what the private sector does so brilliantly. So somehow we have to blend those two approaches, take the best of the private sector, but of course marry it to the hard scientific effects, messages about what's good for you. And finally, the game changer here, what's the game changer? Youth. Youth is the game changer. They are becoming so much more active, so much more agents of change. They're saying to me and to my colleagues at GAIN and everyone in the sector, we're having to live with these decisions that you guys are making. We'll have to live with them for 3 and 4 times as long, maybe 10 times as long as you will have to live with them. We want a voice. We want a voice, and actually we're doing stuff. You should pay attention to us, and we want a seat at the table. We don't want to end up on the table.
Well, they said many more people need a seat at the table, and I think that comes back to the point that you made about diversity. But Dr. Haddad, you know, one of the issues I want both Vinita and you to talk about, and that is something that you mentioned in the context of putting together game-changing solutions, and that is to change the way that the world looks at incentivizing. You believe that there should be some sort of a consensus as far as food prices are concerned, or at least a true reflection of food prices. Now, you know, how do we get there? And again, in the context of a country like India, where there is so much back and forth, for instance, on subsidies, on minimum support price to farmers, what farmers get to make, you know, how do we arrive at what is truly the right price that is reflected as far as food is concerned?
I mean, it's one of those things that's easy to say, but very difficult to do. First of all, let me say, there's a lot of money in the food system, a lot. Most of it is pointing in the wrong direction, private money and public money. So the first challenge is, I mean, we talked about what can governments do. Governments can do a lot. Governments routinely subsidize the production and consumption of foods. Most of those subsidies are kind of locked in a 1980s mentality, when hunger was the main problem for most countries around the world. And now the main problem for most countries around the world is actually nutritious diets, unhealthy diets. So we need to shift a small percentage of those subsidies from staple foods to non-staples that are healthy. I'm talking about fruits, vegetables, pulses, millets. It's the year of the millet. eggs, dairy, fish. These foods are rich in micronutrients, low sometimes in environmental footprints. Governments subsidize the things they've been subsidizing for the last 50 years. Politically, very difficult to shift those, but very important. Another example is governments are the biggest purchasers of food. They buy it for their schools, their social protection programs, their prison systems, their health systems. There are examples from around the world, a small number, but they're growing, of governments at the state level and the district level and sometimes the national level saying, we are going to purchase not just rice or wheat or maize, we're going to purchase pulses and maybe some vegetables to add to the school meal. So governments can do a lot. Similarly, agricultural R&D. Most of it goes to the big four crops, the big four staples. Very little goes to the productivity of fruits and vegetables and nuts. So governments can do a lot. It's going to be difficult to measure the true value of food and to get people to use it because some foods will become more expensive and some foods will become less expensive. I think the foods that become less expensive are going to be the foods that are healthier, that do less damage to the environment because the negative externalities they generate are going to be that the unhealthy foods and the foods that are bad for the environment will now be reflected in their prices. So I think there will be a rebalancing, but it will be a brave government to take that on.